Murphy Moretti did not believe in miracles, nor did he believe in coincidences within the razor-wired perimeters of his Chicago estate. At 39, the undisputed patriarch of the Moretti syndicate regarded every breathing soul beneath his vaulted ceilings either as a managed asset or a calculated threat. The night air carried the sharp, metallic tang of an impending autumn storm, vibrating heavily against the reinforced bulletproof glass of the private corridor on the third floor. It was past midnight, a sanctuary hour when even his closest associates, including his chief administrator Marco Bellini, maintained a respectful distance from his personal quarters. Yet, amidst the silent luxury of antique mahogany panels and priceless oil paintings, an unexpected anomaly broke the uniform stillness. A soft, rhythmic scuffing sound echoed against the polished marble floor near the service staircase, completely devoid of the shop lever click characteristic of trained bodyguards. Murphy stepped out from the shadows of his private study, his hand instinctively resting on the cold forged grip of a hidden sidearm within his tailored charcoal waistcoat. His eyes, hardened by 15 years of continuous blood feuds and corporate executions, narrowed as they pierced the dim amber glow of the emergency wall sconces. Crouched near the heavy velvet drapery was a tiny, fragile silhouette, no taller than the knee-high baseboards carved with intricate neoclassical floral motifs. It was a child, a 3-year-old girl with tangled blonde hair tied into a clumsy, lopsided ponytail, wearing an oversized gray cardigan that swallowed her small frame entirely. Her name was Lily, daughter of Allie Carter, a low-ranking housemaid assigned to the subterranean laundry sector, who had somehow slipped past the strict security checkpoints. Murphy froze, an unfamiliar spasm tightening across his chest, reminding him with brutal biological precision of a past he had systematically burned out of his memory. Children did not exist in the Moretti Empire, not because they were forbidden, but because vulnerability was a luxury written in red ink. The toddler clutched a battered cloth rabbit with violently mended ears in one hand, dragging her worn-out shoes against the forbidden floor with absolute innocence. She did not scream, nor did she cower beneath the towering shadow of the most feared syndicate boss in the Midwest. Instead, she raised her chin with astonishing calmness. Her big, luminous eyes mirrored the amber light, reflecting an ancient depth that seemed completely disconnected from her tender age of 36 months. "You are walking where the lights are dark, mister," Lily whispered, her voice carrying a hauntingly clear cadence that cut through the heavy silence of the corridor. Murphy's breath caught in his throat, his boots locked onto the marble as if anchored by invisible chains forged from decades of repressed trauma and calculated regret. He had killed men for less than unauthorized trespassing in this restricted wing, yet here he stood, disarmed by a toddler whose shoes were literally falling apart. "Little girl," Murphy spoke, his voice dropping into a gravelly metallic baritone that usually made seasoned contract killers drop their weapons in sheer terror. "Do you know whose house this is? Do you know what happens to people who wander where they do not belong behind these iron gates?" Lily blinked slowly, unfazed by the threat, and took 2 clumsy steps closer to the syndicate leader, lifting her small hand to offer a crumb of draw bread. "Mommy says big houses are very cold inside," Lily replied softly, tilting her head with a chillingly profound insight that made Murphy's blood run instantly cold. "She says cold houses make people forget how to smile, so I came here to give you 3 wishes to warm it up. Just like the storybook." Murphy's heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer against a prison wall, every logical defense mechanism in his brain flashing warning sirens. 3 wishes. A childish game told by desperate mothers to console their starving infants in the slums, yet uttered here in the epicenter of absolute power. Before he could dismiss her or summon the security detail to sweep the floor clean, Lily raised her index finger and spoke her absolute first wish aloud. "My first wish is that my mommy stops crying in the laundry room every night when she thinks I am asleep, because her hands are bleeding from the bleach." The words hit Murphy like a physical blow from a rusted iron pipe, knocking the air straight out of his lungs and forcing his gaze toward the far-end hallway. The laundry room was directly connected to the estate's primary chemical supply line, a place where low-wage workers toiled 17 hours a day without proper protective gear. And Marco Bellini's signed administration manifests explicitly stated that all safety protocols were fully funded, operational, and audited on a weekly basis without exception. A dark, suffocating realization began to coil around Murphy's throat, whispering of internal betrayal, systematic embezzlement, and a massive cover-up happening right under his nose. His eyes snapped back down to the small girl whose innocent gaze was now shimmering with unshed tears that mirrored the exact shade of his long-lost mother's eyes. The Mafia boss, a man who had buried 42 enemies without blinking an eye, felt a burning sting behind his eyelids that threatened to breach his iron defenses. He slowly knelt down on one knee, dragging his expensive trousers across the dusty marble floor, completely ignoring the stunned guards watching from the distant security monitors. "Your wish is granted, little one," Murphy muttered, his voice cracking slightly as he touched the frayed ear of the cloth rabbit with a trembling fingertip. That single moment of raw, unexpected vulnerability marked the irreversible fracture of the Moretti Empire, setting off a chain reaction that would tear the underworld apart. Little did Murphy know, this innocent child was not just a wandering soul, but the living, breathing key to a 10-year-old conspiracy designed to annihilate his entire bloodline. The trap had already been sprung, and the first drop of blood had just hit the pristine marble floor, signaling the dawn of an unstoppable reckoning. Marco Bellini did not panic when he first heard about the paid weekend granted to Allie Carter, though his left eye twitched once behind his rimless glasses. 10 years of undisputed control over the Moretti estate payroll had taught him that anomalies were manageable as long as they remained isolated errors. However, an anomaly authorized directly by Murphy Moretti himself was no longer a clerical mistake. It was an active, seismic tremor in the foundation of his architecture. Sitting at his mahogany terminal in the administrative annex, Marco ran his slender fingers across the polished keys, pulling up Allie Carter's employment history. The screen flickered, displaying 17 separate leave requests submitted over the past 3 years, every single one bearing his own digital rejection stamp. He remembered each request vividly, treating them not as human appeals from a tired mother, but as minor operational friction to be eliminated for maximum efficiency. If Allie Carter suddenly received a weekend off with full pay, other lower-tier workers in the laundry and kitchen sectors might start asking dangerous questions. Questions led to audits. Audits led to financial discrepancies, and financial discrepancies would inevitably uncover the 4 shell companies funneling funds to the Romanos. Marco adjusted his cuffs, his pulse remaining unnervingly steady as he formulated a counter-strategy designed to neutralize the threat before it expanded. He opened the master attendance override panel, entering his administrator credentials to alter the digital signatures on Allie's past waiver agreements. If the boss wanted to play the benevolent patriarch, Marco would ensure the baseline data proved that Allie had willingly traded her rest for extra cash. He typed swiftly, forging the consent markers with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent a decade falsifying his way through syndicate ledgers. Yet, as he hit the final save command, a tiny warning dialog box popped up on the bottom right corner of his primary monitor screen. Database synchronization mismatch detected in Sector 4. The system beeped quietly. An automated check introduced during the recent network security upgrade. Marco frowned, dismissing the warning with a flick of his wrist, unaware that Marco had quietly flagged his terminal for background integrity logging hours ago. Across the estate in his private study, Murphy Moretti stared at the initial audit notes delivered by Margaret Ellis regarding historical staff grievances. The names in Margaret's worn cloth notebook matched the dates of Ali's rejected applications, painting a damning portrait of systematic internal oppression. Murphy leaned back in his leather chair, his dark eyes narrowing as he traced the clean, unbroken line of authority running directly through Marco's office. For 10 years, he had believed Marco's administrative perfection was a testament to loyalty, failing to realize that absolute perfection was often a mask for control. "You have grown too comfortable, Marco," Murphy whispered into the empty room, his voice carrying the dangerous chill of a predator sensing a traitor. The following morning, the estate schedule was officially updated to reflect Ali Carter's first mandatory paid weekend off, posted on the board outside the kitchen. When Ali saw her name highlighted in green ink, she stood frozen for nearly a minute, unable to believe her tired eyes would actually see sunlight. Nearby, Marco watched her reaction from the shadows of the arched doorway, his expression an inscrutable mask of polite corporate professionalism. "Enjoy your rest, Miss Carter," Marco said smoothly, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of Ali's neck stand up. Ali clutched her cleaning rag tighter, murmuring a cautious thank you before hurrying away toward the laundry sector, her instincts screaming silent warnings. She knew too well that kindness in the Moretti domain rarely came without an attached price tag, especially when distributed by the chief administrator. Later that afternoon, little Lily approached Akko in the service hallway while holding her mended cloth rabbit, staring up at him with unblinking clarity. "Your clock is ticking backward, mister," Lily stated softly, her voice echoing strangely against the stone floor, before she turned and skipped away. Marco felt an icy jolt pierce his chest at the child's words, momentarily losing his composure as he stared down the empty, winding corridor. He quickly regained his outward poise, adjusting his glasses, but the seed of unease had already taken deep root in his calculated mind. That evening, Marco initiated Phase 2 of his containment plan, drafting a fabricated disciplinary report accusing Ali of gross negligence and inventory theft. He intended to use the false report as leverage to force Ali and her daughter off the estate grounds permanently before the weekend could begin. Unbeknownst to him, Margaret Ellis was cleaning the hallway adjacent to his office, her sharp ears catching the rhythmic clicking of his hidden printer. Margaret memorized the sound of the paper tray and the specific timestamp, slipping away into the darkness to log yet another piece of evidence. The trap was no longer just between the syndicate boss and his corrupt administrator. It had expanded into a full-scale underground war. Every keystroke Marco made brought him closer to the edge of a cliff, driven by his own desperate need to conceal a decade of systematic treason. Murphy Moretti reviewed the newly altered digital files sent from the audit team, noting the exact minute Marco had attempted to cover his tracks. "He is trying to burn the bridge before we can cross it," Murphy murmured, sliding the printed logs into his personal drawer beside the crayon drawing. The stage was set for an inevitable collision, where a little girl's simple wish would dismantle an empire built on lies and calculated bloodshed. The iron gates of the Moretti estate swung open with a heavy, protesting groan under the damp morning drizzle, marking the forced departure of Ali Carter and her 3-year-old daughter. Marco Bellini stood under the stone archway of the administrative wing, his hands tucked neatly behind his back, watching the small, shabby suitcase roll across the gravel. He had orchestrated the expulsion with surgical precision, executing a fabricated disciplinary notice that accused the young mother of gross insubordination and negligence. To anyone else on the payroll, it looked like a standard administrative termination, driven by a strict supervisor, enforcing policy without personal malice. However, Beneath the surface of his calm demeanor, Marco's heart beat with a frantic rhythm born from the acute awareness that Murphy Moretti was getting too close to the truth. As Allie stepped through the outer perimeter, clutching Lily's tiny, cold hand, she felt a profound weight of injustice settle upon her tired shoulders. She had given 3 years of her youth to scrubbing floors in a fortress that fed on human misery, only to be cast out into the freezing Chicago rain without a backward glance. Little Lily walked quietly beside her, her fingers locked tightly around the mended cloth rabbit, her wide eyes reflecting an eerie calmness that unsettled even the gate guards. Back inside the main mansion, Murphy Moretti stood alone in the second-floor service corridor, where the incident had occurred barely an hour earlier. He had been reviewing the security logs when Margaret Ellis handed him a small, folded piece of cheap paper she had retrieved from the base of the western pillar. "The little girl dropped it when they were being forced out, sir," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly as she offered the damp artifact to her employer. Murphy took the paper, drinking his thumb and forefinger, unfolding it slowly to reveal another of Lily's amateurish crayon drawings rendered in bright, vivid hues. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a child's imaginative sketch. 3 stick figures beneath a blazing sun, flanked by crude representations of trees. Yet, as Murphy's piercing gaze swept across the corner of the paper, his training as a syndicate leader immediately caught an unnatural anomaly within the strokes. The green crayon used for the foliage had been pressed down with deliberate, rhythmic pressure, forming a sequence of dots and dashes along the margin line. It was not a random scribbling of a toddler. It was an encrypted, Morse-like notation mapping out financial routing codes, used exclusively by high-level syndicates. Murphy's breath hitched in his throat, his dark eyes widening as he recognized the exact format of the offshore shell accounts Marco used for payroll administration. How did a 3-year-old child possess knowledge of secret ledger codes that only the chief administrator and himself had access to within this heavily guarded estate? The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Lily had not drawn this code out of thin air. She had copied it from the margin of a document left on Marco's desk. During her silent hours wandering the service hallways, her photographic memory had absorbed the intricate numbers and symbols, translating them into her innocent artwork. "You clever, terrifying little angel," Murphy whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden overwhelming surge of protective fury that threatened to shatter his cold exterior. He clutched the crayon, drawing tightly against his chest, feeling the wax indentation bite into his palm as the full scale of Marco's 10-year deception became glaringly clear. Marco had not only embezzled funds and framed innocent staff members, he had been actively selling Moretti security routes to the Romano family, using these exact routing codes. And to cover up his tracks, the administrator had ruthlessly targeted Allie and her daughter, using a fabricated disciplinary scandal to drive them out before they talked. Murphy spun on his heel, his heavy wool coat billowing behind him as he strode purposefully toward the private elevators leading down to the security command center. "Nico," Murphy barked into his encrypted lapel communicator the moment the elevator doors slid shut, his tone carrying the lethal authority of a condemned executioner. "Track every vehicle that left the Western Service Gate in the last 20 minutes. Find Allie Carter and her child before Marco's cleaning crew reaches them." Through the static of the earpiece, Nico's voice came back instantly, cool and focused. "Already on it, boss. Traffic cameras show their bus heading toward the North Station." "Do not let them out of your sight," Murphy ordered, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned ghostly white against the dim emergency lighting. Up in his executive office, Marco Bellini sat at his polished mahogany desk, calmly sipping a cup of freshly brewed espresso while reviewing the morning's shipping manifests. He felt a brief flicker of satisfaction, knowing that the troublesome housekeeper and her irritating spawn were now miles away from the estate's dangerous perimeters. With Allie gone, the digital trail leading back to his offshore accounts was severed, leaving no living witness who could connect his signature to the Romano payoffs. He adjusted his rimless glasses, picking up a gold-plated fountain pen to sign off on a routine maintenance invoice for the subterranean laundry chemical supply line. Yet as the nib touched the heavy parchment, the intercom on his desk chimed unexpectedly, breaking the sterile silence of his private administrative annex. "Mr. Bellini," a cold, metallic voice echoed through the speaker, carrying a pitch-black resonance that made the hairs on the back of Marco's neck stand on end. "Step into the hallway immediately. We need to discuss the artistic merits of a certain crayon drawing found near the western gate." Marco's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering sharply against the porcelain coffee cup and spilling dark liquid across the pristine white financial ledgers. The game was up. The illusion of control had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and the true reckoning of the Moretti Empire had finally begun to unfold. The night was thick with an oppressive silence as Murphy Moretti sat at the heavy oak table in the underground security annex, surrounded by towering stacks of financial ledgers. The forensic auditors he had summoned at midnight were working with mechanical precision, their fingers flying across encrypted terminals to cross-reference every transaction. Nico stood beside the central monitor, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glare of scrolling database queries that unmasked a decade of systematic deception. The encryption on the secondary payroll servers wasn't broken from the outside, boss, Nico reported, his voice dropping to a low, grim register. It was designed with a native administrative backdoor, installed precisely 10 years ago, the exact month Marco Bellini took complete control of the estate accounts. Murphy did not flinch, his dark eyes fixed on a printed spreadsheet detailing 4 offshore shell companies funneling millions directly to Romano syndicates. Every single entry bore Marco's digital signature, masked cleverly behind routine equipment maintenance and chemical supply expenditures for the laundry sector. "He didn't just steal money from our operating budget," the senior auditor added, placing a highlighted ledger sheet squarely in front of Murphy. "He sold our security movement logs, shipping manifests, and private meeting schedules every single time a major trade negotiation took place." The realization hung heavy in the damp air, chilling the room far more effectively than the underground air conditioning unit could ever hope to achieve. 10 years of blind trucks had been systematically weaponized against the Moretti family by the very man trusted to protect its daily operations. Murphy traced his thumb across the printed signature at the bottom of the fraudulent audit sheet, feeling the cold weight of absolute betrayal settle into his bones. "And what about Allie Carter and her child?" Murphy asked, his voice carrying a dangerous, razor-thin edge that made the auditors step back involuntarily. "They weren't just collateral damage," Nico answered, pulling up a secondary log file containing restricted personnel access records from 4 months prior. Allie stayed late in the service corridor to clean the main administrative wing while Marco was dispatching encrypted data packets to the Romano network. She didn't see the screen, but Marco caught her reflection in the polished glass panel of his office door, and he marked her as a live liability ever since. Everything clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The fabricated disciplinary reports, the denied leave requests, and the desperate rush to drive them out. Marco had engineered their expulsion not out of routine administrative policy, but because a 3-year-old girl's innocent mother had accidentally witnessed a ghost. He thought he could sweep them under the rug and burn the records before anyone noticed, Murphy murmured, standing up slowly from his chair. The heavy wool coat draped over his shoulders swung as he paced toward the steel-reinforced door leading to the upper residential levels of the estate. "Where is Marco right now?" Murphy demanded, his gaze locking onto Nico with the lethal intensity of a predator ready to spring upon its prey. "He's currently in his office on the second floor, reviewing morning shipping manifests as if nothing in the world has changed," Nico replied instantly. Murphy pulled a heavy silver pocket watch from his waistcoat, flipping the engraved lid open to check the exact time against the digital server clock. "Do not alert him. Do not lock his terminal yet," Murphy instructed, his tone brooking no argument from the assembled specialists in the room. "Let him believe his web is still holding firm until I decide the exact second to snap every single thread he spent a decade weaving." The auditors nodded silently, returning to their terminals to compile the final evidentiary binder that would condemn the chief administrator beyond appeal. Outside the annex, the first streaks of pale dawn began to pierce through the heavy iron gates of the courtyard, signaling the approach of a brutal reckoning. Murphy walked up the spiral stone staircase alone, his boots echoing sharply against the ancient masonry that had witnessed generations of Moretti power struggles. In his pocket, right beside his concealed weapon, rested the crumpled crayon drawing of a little girl sleeping beneath a very large sun. The contrast between the innocent artwork and the blood-soaked ledgers below encapsulated the entire war he was about to unleash upon his own household. He reached the second-floor corridor, pausing briefly outside the frosted glass door of Marco's private office, where soft classical music played in the background. Through the thin panel, he could see the faint silhouette of Marco adjusting his rimless glasses and turning another page of his immaculate spreadsheets. "Enjoy your finer hours of peace, Marco," Murphy whispered into the empty corridor, his hand resting lightly on the brass handle of the adjacent door. The trap was fully set, the digital evidence was locked beyond tampering, and the true masters of the Moretti estate were about to reclaim their domain. Every keystroke Marco had made over the past 10 years had become the noose that would soon tighten around his meticulously tailored neck. And somewhere out in the cold Chicago morning, Allie and little Lily were safe, protected by a network of guards who now answered to a completely different master. The empire was waking up from a decade-long nightmare, and the purge of the corruption had officially entered its final, unstoppable phase. The morning shadows stretched long and twisted across the cracked asphalt of the Western Industrial District, hiding dangers within abandoned structures. Inside the perimeter of the Moretti estate, the digital alarms had been temporarily frozen to prevent Marco Bellini from sensing the impending raid. Yet, the administrator had already activated his contingency plan, sensing the invisible tightening of the noose around his administrative office. He had known for weeks that absolute perfection could not withstand a dedicated forensic audit once suspicion took root in a master's mind. His primary objective was no longer to salvage the embezzled millions, but to eliminate the accidental witnesses who had sparked the internal review. Allie Carter and her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, were currently locked inside the rear cabin of an unmarked utility van heading toward Ellery Street. The vehicle bounced violently over potholes, kicking up gray dust that settled heavily upon the desolate wasteland of empty steel manufacturing plants. Allie clutched her daughter against her chest, her knuckles turning bone white as she shielded the child from the harsh vibrations of the moving floor. "Keep your eyes closed, sweet pea, and hold on to your rabbit," Allie whispered, her voice trembling slightly, despite her desperate attempt at composure. Little Lily did not cry. Instead, she pressed her mended cloth rabbit closer to her collarbone and nodded with an eerie, heartbreaking maturity. "The bad man is running out of time, Mommy," Lily whispered back softly, her luminous eyes reflecting the dim amber light of the cabin interior. Up front, two hired mercenaries traded nervous glances, their knuckles gripping their steering wheels as they monitored their secure radio frequencies. Bellini said, "Drop them inside Warehouse 4 and plant the fabricated Romano contact files in their luggage before the cleanup crew arrives." The driver muttered. "And if Moretti's security team intercepts us before we finish planting the evidence?" his partner asked, shifting his weight uneasily on the passenger seat. "Then we burn the whole building down with everyone inside it," came the cold, ruthless reply that echoed through the small, enclosed metal cabin. Back at the main mansion, Murphy Moretti stood over the central diagnostic terminal in the underground bunker, his face illuminated by a harsh blue glow. "They cleared the western service gate 6 minutes ago, boss," Nico reported, his fingers flying across dual keyboards to track the van's GPS transponder. "The vehicle is registered under an inactive shell maintenance contract, originally approved by Marco's secondary administrative signature." Murphy did not blink. His dark eyes were fixed on the blinking red dot moving steadily toward the abandoned steel warehouses near the riverfront. "How many men are escorting the vehicle?" Murphy asked, his baritone voice dropping into an Arctic register that signaled lethal intent. Intercepted radio chatter indicates a 3-man tactical cell backed by Marco's personal enforcers inside the target building. Nico answered instantly. Murphy reached down, unlatching a heavy steel case resting on the table to reveal a customized matte black firearm and spare high-capacity magazines. "Mobilize the strike team," Murphy ordered, slipping the sidearm into his tailored holster with fluid, practiced precision born from years of syndicate warfare. "Surround the entire block on Ellery Street. Do not let a single rat escape through the drainage tunnels or the loading bays." "Understood, boss," Nico replied, locking down the perimeter feeds as Murphy turned on his heel and strode toward the waiting transport vehicles. The journey to the Western Industrial District took barely 12 minutes, yet to Murphy, every second felt like an eternity, stretching across broken glass. His mind raced back to the moment he had held Lily's crayon drawing in the service corridor, realizing how close he had come to destroying his own redemption. If he failed to reach them in time, the silence of the Moretti Empire would become a permanent tomb for the only innocence left inside his world. The transport vehicles halted 3 blocks away from Warehouse 4, their headlights extinguished to blend seamlessly into the surrounding industrial decay. Murphy stepped out into the freezing wind, his heavy wool coat snapping around his legs as he motioned his men forward into tactical formation. The warehouse stood before them like a monolithic concrete tomb, its rusted iron doors bolted shut and its upper windows painted black from the inside. Inside the cavernous structure, Allie and Lily had been dragged from the utility van and tied firmly to heavy wooden chairs beneath a flickering overhead lamp. Marco Bellini stood a few yards away, adjusting his rimless glasses as he calmly watched his subordinates scatter forged documents across the dusty floor. "It is unfortunate it had to come to this, Miss Carter," Marco said smoothly, his voice carrying an unnerving tone of administrative detachment. "You and your daughter simply happened to be standing in a corridor where history was being written by people far above your station." Allie raised her chin, defiance flashing in her tired eyes, despite the ropes biting painfully into her wrists. You are a coward, Marco. You stole from the man who trusted you. And now you want to murder a child to keep your stolen ledgers hidden from the light. Marco smiled thinly, stepping closer to examine the counterfeit Romano contact files scattered near the base of Allie's wooden chair. Survival requires collateral damage, my dear, Marco replied coldly, reaching into his coat pocket to retrieve a heavy brass lighter with a polished finish. When Mr. Moretti arrives to inspect the ruins, he will find conclusive proof that you were enemy operatives selling his security secrets all along. Before Marco could flick the ignition wheel, a deafening explosion shattered the reinforced northern steel doors of the massive industrial warehouse. Thick gray smoke billowed inward as flashbang grenades illuminated the cavernous interior with blinding white light and thunderous concussive force. "Breach! Breach! Move in!" shouted the lead tactical specialist, as Moretti's elite enforcers swarmed through the smoke with military precision. Gunfire erupted across the concrete floor, echoing sharply against the iron beams as Marco's guards scrambled to return fire from behind storage crates. Murphy Moretti strode through the center of the smoke like an avenging phantom, his weapon leveled with absolute, unyielding dead-eye accuracy. Two mercenaries rushed toward him from the shadows, but before they could raise their barrels, Murphy's sidearm barked twice with lethal efficiency. Both men dropped instantly, their bodies hitting the dusty concrete with heavy, lifeless thuds that punctuated the chaos of the ongoing firefight. Marco spun around in sheer panic, his face losing all its composed color as he realized his escape routes had been completely cut off from every side. "Murphy!" Marco shouted over the din of battle, his hands instinctively rising into the air as the syndicate boss closed the distance between them. "You do not understand what is really happening here. The family is rotten from the inside out, and I was merely protecting our interests." Murphy did not slow his pace. His dark eyes burned with an intensity that made Marco step backward until his heels hit a stack of iron drums. "You touched a child, Marco," Murphy said, his voice dropping into a razor-thin whisper that carried further than any shouting voice could reach. "You betrayed every principle this house was built upon, and now your ledger has finally reached its final, unalterable balance." Murphy raised his weapon, leveling the barrel squarely at Marco's forehead as the remaining guards dropped their weapons and surrendered in terror. Across the room, the tactical team sliced through the ropes binding Allie and little Lily, lifting the mother and child safely out of the crossfire zone. Allie buried her face in her hands, sobbing with overwhelming relief, while Lily clutched her mended rabbit and stared directly at Murphy across the smoke. The trap had sprung. The predator had become the prey, and the corrupt administrator was about to face the ultimate reckoning of the Moretti Empire. The deafening crack of high-caliber rounds echoed through the hollow steel framework of the warehouse, shattering the dim amber illumination overhead. Sparks showered down from the rusted iron beams as stray bullets slammed into concrete pillars, sending fine gray dust billowing into the chilled air. Murphy Moretti did not flinch as a round whistled past his ear, embedding itself deeply into a wooden packing crate barely inches from his shoulder. His eyes remained locked on Marco Bellini, who was now scrambling backward across the gritty floor, his face twisted in a mask of frantic desperation. "Stay back, Moretti!" Marco shrieked, his voice cracking with unnatural pitch as he lunged forward and grabbed Allie Carter by her hair, pulling her upright. With his free hand, Marco jerked a concealed silver pistol from his inner pocket, pressing the barrel hard against Allie's trembling temple. "One more step and the mother dies right here before your eyes," Marco screamed, using her body as a living human shield against the advancing syndicate boss. Allie gasped in pain, her hands gripping the ropes that still loosely bound her wrists, yet her gaze remained defiant as she looked down at little Lily. Lily had curled into a tight ball on the dusty floor beside the overturned chair, clutching her mended cloth rabbit against her chest without making a sound. Murphy halted instantly, his boots locking onto the concrete as a dark, lethal fury surged behind his eyes, freezing the ambient temperature in the room. "You are making a fatal calculation, Marco," Murphy whispered, his baritone voice cutting through the ringing gunfire with terrifying, absolute clarity. "You think holding a hostage changes the ledger? Every second you delay increases your debt beyond anything this earth can ever pay back." Marco's hands trembled violently, the sweat running down his temples, catching the flickering light of the burning insulation panels above them. "I gave 10 years of my life to this family," Marco ranted hysterically, tightening his grip on Allie's hair until she winced under the intense physical pressure. "I made sure the numbers balanced while you played warlord in the boardroom. I deserved more than being treated like an expendable clerk." "You were trusted," Murphy replied, taking one slow, deliberate step forward while keeping his weapon leveled with millimeter precision. "And you chose to sell your soul to the Romanos for pocket change while murdering the very people who trusted your administrative competence." Before Marco could pull the trigger or utter another frantic justification, Nico materialized silently from the shadows behind a stack of steel drums. With military efficiency, Nico raised a silenced tactical carbine, aiming directly at the hand Marco was using to hold the firearm against Allie's head. A soft pneumatic thud broke the silence of the warehouse, followed immediately by a sharp, piercing shriek of absolute agony from the corrupt administrator. Marco's hand exploded in a burst of blood as the bullet cleanly shattered his wrist, forcing the silver pistol to slip from his fingers and clatter onto the floor. Allie dropped instantly to her knees, gasping for air as Murphy surged forward across the concrete like an unleashed storm, closing the distance instantly. Before Marco could clutch his shattered wrist, Murphy's heavy boot struck his chest, sending the administrator crashing backward against a stack of iron drums. The impact knocked the remaining wind out of Marco's lungs, leaving him gasping like a stranded fish upon the dry, dusty floor of the abandoned facility. Murphy stood over him, his dark eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire that mirrored the righteous wrath of an empire reclaiming its stolen honor. "You wanted power, Marco," Murphy said coldly, lowering his weapon so the barrel rested lightly against the center of the traitor's forehead. "You wanted to sit at the head of the table without earning a single scar. But a house built on treason always collapses upon the heads of its architects." Marco spat a mouthful of dark blood onto the concrete, his eyes wide with terror as he realized there were no more shell companies left to buy his escape. "Please, Mr. Moretti, spare me," Marco whimpered, his previous administrative arrogance entirely evaporated into the cold, damp factory air. "We can rebuild. We can clean the ledgers together, just like old times." Murphy did not smile. He simply nodded toward Nico, who stepped forward with heavy steel restraints and hauled the screaming traitor to his feet. "Take him down to the underground holding cells," Murphy ordered, his voice echoing authoritatively against the high concrete walls of the warehouse. "Let him review every single fraudulent entry he made over the past 10 years, while he waits for the family tribunal to pass its final, unalterable sentence." Nico dragged the thrashing administrator toward the waiting transport vehicles, leaving a dark trail of blood across the cracked asphalt of the loading bay. Murphy turned around slowly, his gaze softening as he looked down at Allie, who was frantically pulling little Lily into her arms to shield her from the carnage. He knelt beside them, extending a strong, steady hand to help Allie to her feet, while gently patting the little girl's tangled blonde hair. "It is over," Murphy said softly, his voice carrying a word that had been missing from his life for nearly 3 decades of bloodshed and isolation. You are safe now, both of you. No one in this city will ever touch your family again while there is breath left in my body. Ali looked up into his dark eyes, seeing past the feared Mafia boss, to the broken man who had finally found something worth healing. She took his hand, offering a quiet, trembling nod of profound gratitude as the morning sun finally broke through the heavy smog outside the warehouse windows. The crossfire had cleared, the traitors had been purged, and the true foundation of the Moretti Empire was finally ready to be rebuilt from the ashes. The damp air of the underground holding cells tasted heavily of rust, old concrete, and the lingering residue of fear that seeped through every brick. Marco Bellini sat hunched over a heavy iron table, his shattered wrist bandaged tightly, and his tailored suit stained with dark, dried blood spots. The administrative arrogance that had sustained his corporate maneuvers for a decade had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, cynical grin. Murphy Moretti stood directly across the table, his arms folded over his charcoal waistcoat, his expression resembling an unyielding marble monument. "You signed every ledger, Marco," Murphy said, his voice cutting through the damp silence like a sharpened blade drawn from a velvet sheath. "You ratted the funds to the Romano shell companies, and you orchestrated the cover-up that nearly cost an innocent mother and child their lives." Marco chuckled softly, a dry, rattling sound that echoed against the arched stone ceiling before dissolving into the dripping water of the drainage pipes. "You think I was the architect, Moretti?" Marco rasped, lifting his pale, sweat-slicked face to meet the terrifying intensity of Murphy's dark gaze. "You think a humble estate administrator possesses the strategic vision to manipulate shipping lanes and alter regional syndicate tax codes for 10 years? Murphy's eyes narrowed slightly, though his posture remained completely motionless. "Every treason requires a hand to write the ink upon the parchment." "True," Marco whispered, leaning forward until his forehead caught the harsh yellow glare of the overhead incandescent bulb hanging from a frayed cord. "But the ink was purchased by someone sitting much closer to your fireplace than a lowly clerk hiding behind administrative spreadsheets in the basement." Nico stepped forward from the shadows, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "Name names, Bellini, or your suffering will accelerate instantly." Marco laughed, openly this time, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up his fractured arm as he shook his head with bitter, theatrical amusement. "You can kill me today, Nico. You can feed my body to the river rats before the sun sets tonight, and it will change absolutely nothing at all. Because the true parasite within this family wears a ring identical to yours and sits at the head of the boardroom table during every quarterly audit." The words hung in the chilling air like an unexploded shell, freezing the heartbeat of the underground room while the gravity of the revelation sank in. For 15 years, Murphy had hunted enemies outside his gates, assuming internal loyalty was guaranteed by the sheer terror of the Moretti name. Yet, here was undeniable proof that the deepest betrayal had been nurtured within the inner circle, shielded by familial blood and corporate privilege. "Give me the identifier," Murphy ordered, stepping closer until his shadow completely swallowed the battered administrator sitting across the iron table. Marco smiled, blood staining his cracked teeth as he whispered a single name that made even Nico's breath catch in the back of his throat. "Check the offshore trust created on the exact day your father passed away," Marco breathed softly, closing his eyes as if waiting for the final blow. "You will find that my signature was merely a secondary authorization, endorsed by someone who inherited far more than just a seat at your table. Murphy did not strut him. He did not raise his voice or call for the executioners waiting outside the heavy iron door of the holding cell. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out into the corridor, his boots striking the concrete floor with a measured, deliberate rhythm of absolute wrath. The purge was not over. In fact, the true war for the soul of the Moretti Empire was only now beginning to tear open from the inside out. Upstairs, Allie and little Lily were sleeping safely in their restored quarters, unaware that the shadow guarding them was now facing a much darker abyss. Murphy reached his private terminal, punching in the master override sequence to access the legacy family trusts sealed 15 years ago by court decree. As the encrypted files unspooled across the screen, a secondary name blinked into view, confirming the horrifying truth Marco had whispered in the dark. The master had been betrayed not by a servant, but by his own bloodline, proving that the coldest monsters always wear the most familiar faces. The iron gates of the Moretti estate swung open wide under the afternoon sun, no longer operating as a cold barrier of exclusion, but as an open gateway of restitution. In the grand courtyard, where fear had once dictated every heartbeat, workers moved with a newfound sense of dignity, their heads held high and shoulders unbowed. Inside the executive chambers, Murphy Moretti sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing the final restructuring edicts that would permanently alter the syndicate's foundation. Every single exploitative clause invented by Marco Bellini and endorsed by the internal traitor was systematically crossed out and replaced with strict protective mandates. Margaret Ellis stood quietly beside the desk, watching as the undisputed patriarch of Chicago signed the new independent labor agreements with firm, unhesitating strokes. "The transition is complete, sir," Margaret reported, her voice carrying a deep, emotional resonance born from decades of silent endurance within the walls. "Every department has received their revised contracts. The laundry staff now have full safety gear, guaranteed paid leave, and direct independent grievance lines." Murphy nodded slowly, closing the heavy, leather-bound volume of reforms before looking up to meet the loyal housekeeper's glistening eyes. "No more shadows, Margaret," Murphy said quietly, his baritone voice lacking its former harsh edge, replaced instead by a profound, hard-earned peace. "A house built on blood can only survive if its foundation is anchored in justice. We spent 30 years forgetting that truth. We will never forget it again." Later that afternoon, a sleek black transport vehicle halted before the main entrance steps of the estate, carrying the two guests who had changed the course of history. Allie Carter stepped out into the crisp autumn air, her expression a mixture of profound disbelief and quiet, radiant courage as she looked up at the towering stone facade. In her hand, she held the small suitcase containing their meager belongings, though this time she walked with the assurance of someone who owned her destiny. Beside her walked 3-year-old Lily, clutching her mended cloth rabbit tightly against her chest while wearing a brand new pair of bright red leather shoes. Murphy descended the marble steps to meet them, his dark eyes softening instantly as the little girl looked up and offered him an unreserved, brilliant smile. "Welcome home, Allie. Welcome home, Lily," Murphy said, extending his hand not as a fearful master, but as a protector bound to them by unbreakable ties. Allie placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of genuine respect replacing the cold dread that had accompanied her departure just weeks ago. "Thank you, Mr. Moretti," Allie whispered, her voice steady and clear as she surveyed the transformed courtyard where children could finally play without fear. Lily broke away from their grip for a brief second, running toward the marble base of the western pillar where she had once dropped her crayon drawing. She knelt down and placed a fresh, vibrant yellow sunflower right at the corner, smoothing the petals with the gentle care of a child nurturing a new world. Upstairs in the private study, the hidden security monitors now displayed a peaceful courtyard filled with laughter, sunlight, and absolute, unbreakable security. The internal purge had claimed its toll. The traitors had been cast into the abyss, and the Moretti Empire had finally found its true human heart. Murphy stood by the window, watching Lily skip across the manicured lawn, while Allie walked beside her under a sky completely cleared of storm clouds. The Mafia boss had once believed that keeping doors locked was the only way to survive the ruthless underworld of Chicago. Now, he knew that true strength lay in opening those doors wide enough to let the light in, welcoming the small souls who reminded you how to live again. The reconstruction was complete, and the final chapter of the Great Transformation was ready to be written across a golden, unclouded horizon. The morning mist that typically blanketed the northern edge of Chicago rolled back slowly, revealing a crisp, unobstructed horizon bathed in amber sunlight. Inside the grand executive study of the Moretti estate, the heavy mahogany desk had been cleared of every single blood-stained ledger and encrypted forensic report. In their place rested a single polished silver frame enclosing a crumpled piece of cheap paper adorned with crude crayon strokes and a giant yellow sun. Murphy Moretti stood before the tall arched window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out across the impeccably manicured lawns of his restored domain. Down below, in the central courtyard where fear had once dictated every heartbeat, the air was filled with the sound of genuine, uninhibited laughter. 3-year-old Lily was skipping along the stone pathway in her bright red leather shoes, her mended cloth rabbit tucked securely under her arm like a loyal knight. Behind her walked Allie Carter, her posture straight and her shoulders unburdened by the relentless exhaustion of endless shifts in the subterranean bleach rooms. Margaret Ellis stood nearby, smiling warmly as she handed Lily a fresh slice of apple, while exchanging light-hearted pleasantries with the estate's newly elected staff council. The transformation of the syndicate was complete, forged not in the fires of ruthless vengeance, but in the quiet, undeniable power of absolute restitution. Every exploitative clause had been permanently eradicated, every corrupt operative had been swept away, and every worker now shared in the prosperity of the house. Murphy turned away from the window, his gaze settling upon the framed crayon drawing that had completely altered the trajectory of his formidable life. He had spent 39 years believing that survival required absolute isolation, treating human emotions as dangerous liabilities that invited inevitable destruction. He had built stone fortresses, deployed motion sensors, and surrounded himself with armed guards, only to realize that his greatest vulnerability was his own coldness. It had taken a tiny, ragged child wandering into a forbidden corridor to remind him that an empire built on fear was nothing more than a gilded cage. A soft knock echoed against the heavy oak door of his study, followed immediately by the gentle, familiar click of the brass handle turning from the outside. The door swung open a fraction, and a small blonde head peeked into the room, her big, luminous eyes scanning the vast space with innocent curiosity. "Mr. Murphy?" Lily called out softly, her voice carrying a sweet, melodic clarity that instantly banished the lingering shadows of the past. Murphy's stern features melted into a deep, unreserved smile as he walked around his mahogany desk and knelt down to meet the little girl at eye level. "Come in, little one," Murphy said, his baritone voice warm and entirely devoid of the terrifying edge that once made seasoned criminals tremble in fear.
I was just admiring your artwork. It looks even more magnificent now that it's hanging in a proper silver frame right beside the window. Lily stepped into the study, her bright red shoes clicking softly against the polished parquet floor as she approached the heavy oak desk. She looked up at the framed crayon drawing, then turned her gaze back to Murphy with an expression of profound, childish satisfaction. "Mommy says your house doesn't look cold anymore," Lily announced proudly, reaching into her pocket to pull out a single, perfectly fresh yellow sunflower. She says the sun on the paper finally decided to come inside and warm up all the big rooms where nobody used to smile. Murphy accepted the sunflower with both hands, his fingers gently brushing against the velvety green stem as an overwhelming wave of peace washed over his soul. "Your mother is entirely right, Lily," Murphy whispered, lifting the child effortlessly into his arms and standing up with a newfound lightness in his stride. "The sun is here to stay, and the doors of this house will never be locked against the light again." They walked out onto the private balcony together, stepping into the brilliant morning air just as Allie looked up from the courtyard below. Allie waved up at them, her face radiant with a quiet, beautiful courage that mirrored the boundless promise of the new day unfolding across the city. The Mafia boss had once believed that keeping every door bolted shut was the only way to shield his bloodline from the ruthless underworld of Chicago. Now, he knew that true strength lay in throwing those doors wide open, welcoming the small souls who taught a hardened heart how to live again.
The ledger of betrayal had been balanced, the dark shadows had been banished forever, and the Moretti Empire had finally found its true, unbreakable heart. Below them, the city stretched out toward the horizon in a shimmering expanse of golden light, endless, unclouded, and completely free. Dear friends, the past can never be truly rewritten. The ones we lose along the way can never be brought back. Yet a simple, fearless act of kindness from a child can unlock doors that a lifetime of bitterness and suspicion could never move. Sometimes, the universe does not just return what was taken from us. It gives us the miraculous chance to begin all over again, surrounded by those who love us for who we are. So we leave you with one final question today. Has a tiny, unexpected soul ever walked into your life and completely rewritten your world? Please share your story with us in the comments below. If this journey of redemption and healing touched your heart, tap the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single heartbeat. Share this tale with someone who reminds you of your own safe harbor. May you always be surrounded by souls worthy of your beautiful, fragile heart. And may your doors always remain open to the ones who truly matter. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will meet again soon. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.